Okay, so hi everyone. As said before, I'm Melinda Seckington, and I'll be talking about the art of slide design. So for most of my life, I hated giving presentations. As a kid, as a teenager, as a university student, I was so scared and nervous in front of people that I tried to avoid giving talks as much as I could. And I didn't believe it was something I'd ever be able to do, or that it was something I'd ever be able to enjoy. Nowadays, though, I'm a technical manager at FutureLearn, and it's part of my job to speak at events like this, but also to teach other developers within the company how to do these type of things. And for me, the secret behind giving presentations was in preparation. So I find that whenever I try to learn a new skill, it becomes easier for me if I understand all the different aspects, all the different building blocks of what it is that I'm trying to learn. And with presentations, it was about understanding my emotions and how my face and body reacted whenever I'd be nervous. It would be about understanding how to tell stories. And, sorry, I just lost my notes here. It was about understanding how to tell compelling stories and how to keep the audience engaged. And it was about understanding how to use the tools that I have in the most effective way. And alongside our voice and our words, our slides are basically the most important instrument in our toolbox. And we should learn to use them as effectively as we can. So that's basically what this talk is about, how to create effective slides. But what does that mean? What makes your slides effective? So let's take a step back and look at what is the goal of a presentation. Why are we presenting in the first place? And at first glance, you might think each presentation is different. Some will be about teaching a new skill or knowledge. Some will be to convince people to use a specific product. Some will be to inspire people to do something. There are endless motivations for why someone might give a presentation, but at its core, they all have one thing in common. No matter what your motivation behind the presentation is, your number one goal as a presenter is to allow your audience to absorb your information. So whether you're trying to teach, convince, motivate, frighten, sell, inspire, it's your responsibility to make that easier for your audience. And this all ties in with the concept of cognitive load. So this is the amount of mental activity required to accomplish a goal, with mental activity being things like perception, memory, and problem solving. So this definition comes from this book, Universal Principles of Design, and I'll be referring to it a couple of times during this talk. It's a great resource book covering 125 design principles and ties it back to psychology and physiology research. So when we talk about effective slides, we mean slides that help reduce that cognitive load. Slides that help people rather than prevent them from consuming your information. So how do you create effective slides? How do you create slides that are compelling and also help your audience? And the answer lies in shifting that question to how do you design effective slides? So we can get a better understanding of slide design by looking at design theory. So I'll be sharing 4 principles of slide design, and hopefully this will help you create slides that allow your audience to absorb the information that you're trying to get across. So one thing to bear in mind here is that I don't believe there is one true way of creating slides. This isn't about getting you all to create the same slides that I do. Rather, it's helping you get a basic understanding of design theory and then applying it to your own styles. So the first principle is minimize signal, maximize noise. So this principle comes from the theory of signal-to-noise ratio. This is a concept that in every communication we have, there's a certain amount of relevant information to us, the signal, and there's a certain amount of irrelevant information to us, the noise. And with good designs, we want to maximize the signal and minimize the noise. So ending up with mainly relevant information rather than irrelevant information. So how do we do that in our slide designs? How do we make sure that the information on our slides is mainly relevant rather than irrelevant? And I think there are a few things that we can do to achieve this. So first, focus on one purpose per slide. So this is about maximizing the signal. So the moment a slide has multiple purposes, it dilutes that relevant information that you're trying to get across. So rather than having a single slide covering multiple ideas or concepts, split them out over several slides. Slides are free, so use them as much as you can. This is about making sure that your slide is as relevant as possible to what you are saying at that point of time. This also means 2 things. 1, your slides are not your teleprompter. Because at that point, they have 2 purposes. You're using your slides to get a point across to your audience, and you're using slides as reminders for yourself. If you really need something to help you remember what to say, like I do, use your presenter notes for that, because that's what they're there for. The second thing that slides aren't is they're not meant as notes for or references for people after the talk. Your slides are meant for the audience that are there in the room with you. If you need to share something with people afterwards, use a format that actually makes sense, like a blog post or a video or anything like that that doesn't dilute the signal of the people there in the room. So make your audience the #1 priority. So one thing I see happen a lot is using bullet points on one side to cover multiple ideas. For instance, take this slide about cats. If you're going to be talking for a few minutes about each of the individual points on the slide, you're basically diluting the signal of each point that you're trying to make. It's much better to split out those ideas over multiple slides. So allow your audience to focus on the one thing that you're trying to get across. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't be using bullet points at all, but use them to support the specific purpose of your slide. So for instance, in this case, they are used to list a set of names that belong together. So all the information together is what makes it relevant. The second thing we want to do is make sure our slides aren't distracting. So in this case, we're trying to minimize the noise. So ensuring we don't have any irrelevant information. So I'll give a couple of examples, but there are lots and lots of ways that your slides can be distracting. So try to use common sense to recognize when your slides might be just a little bit too busy. So one way of being distracting is having just way too much text on your slide. Because the moment that you have a slide like this, people stop listening to you because they're either distracted by trying to read all the different stuff that is on there, or they get distracted trying to read and listen to you at the same time. So think about what information really, really matters and distill it down to just the very essential. A variation of this is just having too much code on one slide. I see this a lot at developer conferences. And most of the time, you really don't need all of it. Again, just select the bit that you're focusing on and highlight that. Another way slides can be distracting is when there's way too much going on in them. This is an extreme example, but my cat is really adorable. But I often feel that people want to use all the space that they have in a single slide, making things really busy and just much, much harder to process. So keep your slides simple and clean so that they're not visually distracting. So this shows exactly the same images as before, but because they're not overlapping and because there's no text laid over it, it's just easier for the audience to process. So to recap, you can maximize signal by focusing on one purpose per slide, and you can minimize noise by reducing distractions on your slide. So next, make important information stand out. So again, let's go back to some theory. So the von Restorff effect is a phenomenon where you're more likely to remember things that are noticeably different than things that are common. So this is about making things look more unique or distinctive so that it stands out more and people will remember them. And this is basically what the definition of contrast is. So the state of being strikingly different from something else in juxtaposition or close association. So what we want is to use contrast in our slides to make things memorable. A good example of using contrast comes from this book from Nancy Duarte, which is all about how to make good presentations. And in it, she explains contrast through this visualization, highlighting how we can use contrast in our slides in a couple of different ways, using color, shape, size, shade, and proximity. So in each of these examples, you're automatically drawn to the element that stands out. So I'll only cover 3 of these here and give examples for each of them, because I think shade is actually a variation of color, and proximity isn't actually as easy to apply as the others. So I'll give some quick examples for each of these 3 areas, starting with color. So first step is choose a color palette with contrasting colors. In the case of color, contrasting doesn't necessarily have to mean exact opposite. It's more about having colors that work well together and are different enough from each other that you can see that they are noticeably different. So using my own presentation and as an example, one way of using color contrast is to use it within a slide to highlight the most important phrase or data. So you have noticed that most of my slides follow this example where the yellow is being used to highlight the most important word. Besides using contrast within slides, you can also look at contrast between slides. So if you use Keynote, this is the light table view, and you can see an overview here of all your slides. And this is an overview of one of my presentations from last year. And each time I used a red slide at the beginning of a section to highlight that we were beginning a new section. And because all the other slides are white, the red title slide just stands out much more and makes people pay attention and go, hey, a new thing is starting here. So second way to use contrast is shape. Now, traditionally, when you think of shapes, you think of things like in that example. So circles, squares, triangles. And while they can be used within your slides for contrast, those aren't actually the shapes that we most rely on in our presentations. What we rely on a lot are fonts. So one way of achieving contrast is through using different types of fonts within your presentations. So I tend to use custom fonts because the fonts that are built into our systems are mostly designed for reading paragraphs of text. So they don't always work quite as well on the slide. Also, people are more familiar with them already, so it won't stand out as much as it could. So once you have multiple fonts, you can start playing around with them to create contrast. So in this first example, we are using different fonts within the same phrase or sentence. So the contrast is used to highlight specific words. The second way is using different fonts for different elements on the slide. So it's about making it easy for the audience to understand the different purposes of those elements. Because if all of it was in the same text, it would just make it way too confusing to read and comprehend. So the third way to use contrast is through size. So the simplest way of using size for contrast is just grabbing a single element and making it bigger, using it to make a statement about something. Or you can play around and make each part of the sentence a different size. Again, you'll have noticed I tend to use this format a lot within my own slides. What becomes interesting, though, is when you start pairing different fonts with different sizes. It means that you can really play around with making a slide look quite graphic and more unique, and therefore it makes it more memorable because it stands out more. So those are 3 ways that you can use contrast to highlight key information and make it more memorable for your audience. So principle number 3. Show and tell. So this principle comes from the picture superiority effect, which states that information recall is better when combining text and images. So rather than relying purely on text alone, we should be using visuals to support what we are saying. So people remember things better if they're absorbing that info both in text and in a visual way. So I want to talk about 3 ways of adding visuals to your presentations. The first are photos. So photos are the easiest way of adding visuals to your slides, making them more lively and memorable. The thing with photos, and also with GIFs, is that they do need to be relevant to what you are saying. So keep principle number 1 in mind. Maximize signal, minimize noise. So the moment that photos aren't relevant, or if the connection is too tenuous, the photo only becomes noise. And the easiest way to use photos is to use them to completely fill up the slide and then pair it with some text over it. So just to compare, you can see if you use the smaller image, it just doesn't have as much emotional impact. The smaller image actually makes it more distracting. So by using the image as a background, you're driving the point home much, much more. And if you use the right image, the audience will have a much more visceral reaction. So play around and experiment with different photos and with different fonts, because changing them can make a photo feel really different. So next is icons. So icons work as nice little highlights to cement the text that you're already showing. It's a lot less distracting than photos, but it's enough of a memory cue that it will help people recall information. So the easiest resource for icons is the Noun Project. This is a website that features a ton of royalty-free icons of all different topics, and you're bound to find icons in there that you can use. The third way of adding visuals is using shapes. With shapes, I mean use the shapes that are built into your slide editors. So you can make lines, triangles, circles, squares, etc. And you can achieve quite a lot when you start combining them to create interesting visuals for your slides. A slide like this is much more visceral and memorable than just using a simple list. So once you get the hang of shapes, you can start constructing much more interesting slides, building diagrams that are much clearer than relying on text alone. And finally, if you combine shapes with fonts and with photos, you can really start making your slides look more unique and give them some personality. So those are 3 different ways that you can add visuals to your slides. So using both text and visuals, it means that your audience will be able to grasp ideas and concepts much quicker and will remember them more. So the final principle is be consistent. And when we hear consistent, I think some people interpret that as, let's make everything look the same. I'll use the same background and the same font for every single slide. And that's not what I mean here. In design, consistency is defined like this. The usability of a system is improved when similar parts are expressed in similar ways. So when we're talking about consistency in slide design, it's about making sure that those slides that are similar look and feel the same way. And I think slides are similar if they have a similar purpose. So we're going back to the first principle in a way here. So, bit of a mouthful, but use consistent designs for slides with the same purpose. So this is all about identifying your slide patterns. What are the types of slides within your presentation? And then make sure that they follow the same types of patterns. So I'll use this presentation as an example because for the past 15 minutes, you've been exposed to some of these patterns. So this presentation had the heading slides, bright and yellow to stand out. We then had our design theory slides, followed by our example slides, and then all the other slides which follow the basic design of blue with white and yellow text, with some variations of what appeared on them. So having these building blocks, it means that your audience has references that they can refer to. They become easier to process, even though it might happen subconsciously. So the handy thing of breaking it down like this, it means that for future presentations, you have much more tangible building blocks that you can reuse. And as you do more and more presentations, you end up building up your own library of patterns. And it becomes easier and quicker to put your slides together. So identify your slide patterns. What are the types of slides that are in your presentations? So those are 4 principles of slide design. So to recap, maximize signal, minimize noise, make important information stand out, show and tell, and be consistent. So I hope that by applying these, you make it easier for your audience to consume the information that you're presenting and create more effective and beautiful presentations. So if you had told me 10 years ago that nowadays I would regularly be giving presentations and enjoying it, I would never have believed you. At the time, I assumed that to give a good presentation, I would need to focus a lot on me. So making sure that what I say is good and correct, making sure that I didn't make a fool of myself, making sure that I didn't and. In reality, though, the me part of a presentation isn't really that important. Good presentations are all about the audience. It's your job as a presenter to make sure that you teach, inspire, and motivate your audience. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me and check out the link for the blog post version of this talk. Thank you for listening.